Hey YouTube, today we're going to talk about the Valentinians, the Montanists and the Ebionites, or at least I think I'm going to get to the Montanists and Ebionites. I've tried to get this video done several times and just keep getting interrupted, and we'll see if we can get through it today. In the last few videos we talked about the Johannine, Ebionite, and the Marcionite theologies, and it's important to note that none of them actually called themselves by these names, I'm pretty sure, except maybe the Ebionites. But the Johannine theology, we don't know what that theology was called specifically. We get a hint from Irenaeus, but again, Irenaeus is calling out heresies, and most of these, if you hear the term Marcionite or Valentinian, it's someone claiming that theology is a heresy, and he's just trying to put space in between his theology and one of these. The Ebionites may have called themselves the poor. Not sure about that. Yes, in the last three videos, that's what we talked about. And again, the Johannine theology, they brought with them the idea that the Logos had come down to earth. It had been put on trial. That'd be the trial of Pilate. It had died, went to hell, defeated hell, and resurrected. The Ebionites come up with the idea that Logos was born, and that's pretty much their only contribution as far as I can think of right offhand. The Ebionites believed he was born, and then they believed everything that the Johannine theology believed. The Marcionites did not believe he was born. They're probably a Johannine derivative, but they totally threw out the core concepts of what Jesus was, that he was not the Logos. They made him a spirit being, they demoted Yahweh, and they opened up the doors to Gentiles, which completely changed the religion, and ended up being relatively popular, at least for a short time. And then we get the Valentinians, and this is probably after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 136. Although with the Valentinians, they show no association with that event, unlike a few other theologies that we'll get to a little bit later. The Valentinians, the reason why we have them at 140 is they're sometime after the Marcionites, but and they're obviously before Irenaeus and Theophilus of Antioch. 140 is just a round figure in this case. However, the Valentinians are largely like the Marcionites in a lot of ways. They believe that Yahweh was a demiurge. They may have called him Yaldabaoth, which comes from, it's in the Apocryphon of John, and the Apocryphon of John probably was a Valentinian text. But nevertheless, they believe that he was a demiurge. Unlike the Marcionites, however, they did not believe he was evil. He's just a neutral figure. He's an ignorant figure. He believes he is God, but he has no knowledge of anything higher than himself, and that's why he believes he is God. But he is basically the Old Testament Jewish God, the evil guy, the guy that floods the world, the jealous God, and as such, they don't worship the demiurge. So they're very similar in their way that they handle, say, the Old Testament, the Jewish texts, and the Jewish deity. The difference, again, is that the Marcionites believe that Yahweh was evil, and the Valentinians do not. They believe he's neutralish. It's probably an attempt to give some relevance rather to the Old Testament. To make it to where you could technically be Jewish and go into one of their churches. And again, the previous churches were purely Jewish, the Johannine theology and the Ebionite theologies. The Marcionites cut that out completely, and the way that they do it pretty much eliminates the possibility that there's going to be any kind of reconciliation between Judaism and Christianity. With Valentinians, I think that's what this is an attempt to reconcile those two theologies. A small attempt, because the Valentinists rather does believe that the Marcionites are correct, in the sense that Yahweh is, or rather, is a demiurge, the creator of the universe, but not the God. Not the God that we're all supposed to be worshiping, right? He's not the good God. So, besides that, they probably are docetic, believing that Jesus was some type of a spirit being, just like the Marcionites, and just like the Johannine theology, although the Johannine theology thought he was a logos being, not a spirit being, which is mostly a minor distinction, except in philosophical terms. But beyond that, when people look at the Valentinians and the Valentinian system, they want to look at the entire system, the 30 eons that come from the gospel of truth and from heresy claims. I find all of those eons marginal, really, really marginal and irrelevant by and large. And I find the Valentinian system itself being written down in the gospel of truth to be a humongous mistake. But let's talk about them for just a moment. The Valentinians broke their godhead essentially down into 30 eons, is what they called eons. These eons are forms, just like Platonic forms. They're perfect ideas. And these 30 forms make up parts of the Godhead, and it's broken down into 3 sections, the 8, the 10, and the 12. Okay, 8, 10, and 12 gives you 30. And each ones are paired off, male and female, so you have 4 groupings of 2 pairs each. That makes up the 8. And the same thing with the 10 and the 12. And you could see in that the possibility that the Trinity ended up coming out of those ideas. The idea that eventually, where eventually you have God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, or as Theophilus puts it, God, Jesus, and Sophia. You could kind of see where some people might think that the Trinity came out of that, and it's a possibility, although I see no reason to necessarily say that, yeah, he did it. And the reason why I don't see that is because, like I said earlier, this is a huge, huge mistake. We do not know. The one thing I think that I find mostly fascinating about the Valentinian system is that for everybody else, it's absent. We don't know what the Johannines, the Ebionites, and the Marcionites believed. They could have way more forms than the Valentinians. None of them wrote it down. There is the Apocryphon of James, but that doesn't really describe it very well. Whoever wrote that, probably a later Ebionite wrote that, but no one else describes their Godhead like the Valentinians do. And it reminds me of something like hot dogs. You know, if they told you everything that was in a hot dog, is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, or cigarettes. If they told you everything that was in a cigarette, would that be good or bad for the cigarette industry? It would be bad. That's why it can only be bad. You know, it can only cause them harm financially, right? With the Valentinians, it's a matter of way too much information. And the later theologians like Irenaeus are going to hammer them on everything that they said in the gospel of truth. And, you know, even though Irenaeus, in a lot of ways, the way he talks about it, he doesn't necessarily disagree with the components, with the forms that are being used, but he seems to disagree with how they are being used, how the actions of these eons and stuff. So with Irenaeus, we still don't know what Irenaeus believes. I mean, you could try and piece it together, I suppose, but he's got a lot of books, and I seriously doubt that you'd ever get to any kind of clear understanding. Nothing is as laid out and clear as the Valentinian system. So, huge mistake. But is there anything that the Valentinians really contribute to this theology? Because, again, the major parts of this theology have already been created from the Johannine Ebionites and the Marcionites. With the Valentinians, the only thing that I can think of really that they contribute is by trying to merge or trying to take the evil out of the demiurge, is that they're trying to universalize the theology. They're trying to create a church that has the capacity to bring in both Christians and Jews, where the Marcionites obviously didn't even consider that possibility. The Marcionites just set Judaism on fire and created their own theology, essentially. And that's really just about all I can think of right offhand. I'm sure there was something else. They may, again, have contributed the Trinity, but we're not sure about that. And again, the reason why we're not sure is because nobody else is talking about it. Literally nobody else is talking about it. Nobody else is giving us this great big diagram of how their theology works. And for good reason. There are very good reasons why texts like the Apocryphon of John are secret texts. That why they're only meant to be read by theologians. Theologians that you are basically you're mentoring, essentially. So they're Valentinian. If the Apocryphon of John is Valentinian, then that text went to Valentinian theologians so that they could understand what was going on in heaven and with God. Same thing with the Apocryphon of James, by the way, to explain to their theologians what was going on with God and with heaven, how to understand it. These weren't books that were meant to be widely circulated. So that's most of the Valentinian system that I can think of, again, right offhand. I'm sure I'm missing something. But I'm going to go ahead and jump down to Montanism and the Ebionites. Montanism is the new prophecy. They believe that they can prophesy in their own time, and this is why I have them at 140. Unlike the Valentinians, who get there by, averaging it out, really, and looking at some, there is evidence that they're probably before 160. There's some time after Marcionism. Not really sure when they come in. But with the Montanists, the reason why we've got them at 140 is specifically because of Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 136. Again, in Revelation, chapter 14, is exclusively about the Bar Kokhba revolt. Someone decided at that point that it was important to put this event in the book of Revelation. Not only did they do that, but this event shows up in Mark and Matthew as well, in the very minimal mention of the abomination that causes desolation. This is the only event that could actually fit that. In what the abomination of desolation was a reference to Daniel. In Daniel, it talks about Antiochus Epiphanes invading Jerusalem and setting up a altar to Zeus on the Temple Mount. Fast forward, what is it, about 300 years later to the Bar Kokhba revolt, And what happens? Well, Hadrian has a temple to Jupiter built on the Temple Mount. These things are virtually identical. It's the only thing that matches the description of the abomination that causes desolation from Daniel. And again, it's in Luke. I'm sorry, not Luke. It's in Matthew and Mark. It is not in Luke or John. So, again, with the Montanists are new prophecy types. They believe that they can prophesy in their own time. They believe that their prophecies are as important or more important than older prophecies. So they are the prime candidate for adjusting Revelation. They're also the prime candidate for writing some of the Petrine texts, the Peter epistles, and possibly Jude as well. Of course, we don't have a whole lot of their texts, but that's basically it. That for the Montanists, they are probably a derivative of, I would suggest, the Ebionites. It's a possibility that they're a Johannine derivative, but the Johannine theology is pretty much, we don't know when exactly, but the Johannine theology is going to be dead here within a century or so. It's a weak theology. The Marcionites probably copied part of the Johannine theology and made a much more powerful version of the theology, a Gentile version. But beyond that, the Johannine theology is probably not all that strong by the time you get to the middle of the 2nd century. The Ebionites are still plugging along, probably not getting real big. But the one thing that the Ebionites have that the Johannine theology never had was a birth story, and that is appealing. If you want to talk about a Messiah walking around, even if his birth is miraculous, it's a good idea to have a birth story instead of him just poofing into existence as the Johannine theology. And there were probably other problems with the Johannine theology as well, particularly in marriage and sex and that sort of thing. Things that they're just not going to get over. They are not going to make them very popular. So I think that's all I've got on the Montanists. And then we'll go down to the Ebionites. The Ebionites, I've got them down here as Ebionite B, but really they're the same as the other Ebionites. The big difference here is they've created the Gospel of the Hebrews. That's about it. Now, I should go back to the Montanists real quick. The Montanists may have created or have been or have received, rather, from a theologian, the Gospel of Mark. The reason why I suggest this is, besides, I've talked about this a little bit before with the whole apocalyptic aspect of Mark, but part of that apocalyptic aspect is the whole idea of a secret Gospel of Mark, which shows up in Clement in the late 2nd century. As far as we know, that's the only time, the only gospel that has a secret gospel, a gospel, and it again goes back to the question of whether or not Montanism, or rather the Gospel of Mark, is just purely apocalyptic, meant to be divined from in some way. And nobody said that the Montanists were good at their new prophecy thing. But again, the existence of a secret gospel suggests that that's exactly what Mark was for divining other material from. So I would suggest that the Montanists are the primary user of Mark. And again, with Mark is the one text out of all of them that we have very, very little information on as to who used it. And the Montanists seem to be the prime candidate. They probably also use the Johannine texts, And the Johannine text about this time, either with the Valentinians or the Montanists, has been adjusted quite a lot. The Johannine text will eventually be 3 or 4 times what it originally was. But the Montanists are a good candidate for adjusting John as well. And then, like I said, with the Ebionites, all they bring in is Matthew, or rather the Gospel of the Hebrews. The Gospel of the Hebrews is basically Matthew minus the birth story. Why would they not have a birth story? The reason why Matthew does not have a birth story is because they have already invented the birth story. The birth story is in its own book, the Gospel of James. So you have essentially with every Ebionite theology, they're going to have a birth story, an infancy gospel, and a regular gospel, and the two are equals, even though nobody else seems to believe so. Nobody else believes in the infancy story yet, and even later, when it starts to become a possible part of the Catholic religion, they marginalize it. This idea of a virgin birth, as cutesy as it is and everything, is not terribly popular with theologians. They understand the importance of it, and it will become eventually the part of Catholicism. They understand the importance as far as getting people to believe the theology, but as far as the theology itself, it's a marginal story. The whole story is really about him being put on trial, as the Johannine theology originally had stated, being put on trial, dying, going to hell, defeating hell, and resurrecting. Although the whole defeating hell part, that's another part that will be way, way marginalized, and the text, of course, is going to disappear for centuries. The Gospel of Nicodemus, and the reason why that is the same reason they marginalized the infancy story. Really, it doesn't add anything to the theology. It actually subtracts from the theology, because what the Gospel of Nicodemus suggests is that hell was defeated forever. That it made it sound like there was no possibility whatsoever that anyone would ever go to hell. Well, that's not very beneficial if you're wanting to scare people about hell. That's not a very beneficial text to have around. So, I think that concludes this video, hopefully. And the next video, we're going to talk about the Catholics, I think. We're going to go ahead and bring this information in and talk about what's going on with the later Catholics. The Catholics, just briefly, Catholicism, Catholic means universal. And you can think of universal in a lot of different ways. You could think of it in a modern day universalist sense, where in a modern universalist church, anything goes, right? They don't really even push Christianity at all. You can be an atheist, you could be a Taoist, you could be into Shinto or whatever, and show up at their church. It's more of like a community than anything else, right? That's obviously not what the Catholics are going for. You could think of it in terms of an umbrella trying to bring in all theologies under one central power, and that is part of what the Catholics are getting at. I like to think of the term of Catholic or universal in the sense of one true religion of the entire universe. They are working on reaching the idea of the form of church, which is a form in the Valentinian system. They are trying to reach the perfect idea of church. And therefore, everybody else is just heretics, right? You get to burn their books and kill them off. So we'll talk about the Catholics later. And I think that's all I got for you today. Thanks a lot, folks. Bye.